My name is Sharon Marshall and I'm Chair of the Classical Association Teaching Board. So the CA conference has always included a pedagogical thread running through it, and that's really important to what we do. So this afternoon session is very much in line with that. So I think there are a few people in the classics community in the UK who haven't heard of the excellent work that the Advocating Classics Education Project are doing, which is led by Edith Hall and Arlene Holmes-Henderson. So this session is organised under the auspices of the ACE project, and the title is Accessing Classical Civilization and Ancient History in Britain, Past and Present Perspectives. So our speakers this afternoon are Edith Hall, Professor of Classics at KCL, Arlene Holmes-Henderson, Outreach Officer for the CA, Henry Stead, Lecturer in Latin at the University of St Andrews, and Peter Wright, who's Teacher of Classics at Blackpool Sixth Form College. Unfortunately, Edith is unable to join us this afternoon as she's unwell, but she has pre-recorded a video for us to enjoy. The question and answer tab will be open throughout the session, so please do ask questions as we go. You'll find that on the right-hand side of the page. And our first speaker will be Dr. Henry Stead. Thank you.
In Britain, there is a long and proud tradition of learning about and experiencing the culture of ancient Greece and Rome via English language translations and popular history extending back to the late 17th century. Second-hand translations, school books and encyclopedic reference works could be found on market stalls or in the hawker's basket at affordable prices. But in that earlier period, the autodidact's journey to classical knowledge was not an easy one. By extraordinary determination, intellectual labour, and often a mix of good fortune and going without, encounters between working class men and women in classical literature, while still extremely rare, became increasingly common throughout the 18th century. The results are seen, for example, on the British popular stage and in the broadside ballads of the long 18th century, as well as between the pages of those rare examples of labouring class poets from the 1730s onwards. The best examples of labourer classicists are perhaps Stephen Duck, the Wiltshire agricultural labourer, who became famous for writing a poem called The Thresher's Labour, and who took his own life in 1756 after a ballistic social ascent to the royal court. Then we have Mary Collier, the washerwoman poet, who corrected Duck's masculinist view of labouring in her verse epistle, The Woman's Labour, by invoking an army of Amazons to vindicate the injured sex. And finally, Anne Yearsley, aka Lactilla, the radical milkwoman poet, who was patronised in both senses of the word by the blue-stocking poet Hannah More. All these three were familiar with classical literature through English translation by the likes of Pope and Dryden. But it was in the 19th century that public and affordable access to educational resources improved dramatically. Educational publications from the 1830s onwards provided a more guided route to classical culture than had existed before. The formal infrastructure with the Elementary Education Acts of 1870 and 1880, board schools, and an increasingly standardised curriculum raised the level of rudimentary education. And this was preceded and matched by the rapid evolution of a less formal and largely demand-driven infrastructure for self-education, consisting of public libraries, adult educational establishments, reading rooms, educative and affordable publications, including cheap reprint translations. Tom Berkeley, born in 1852 to impoverished Irish parents, was one who witnessed and took up with enthusiasm these kinds of informal improvements. His father was a rag and bone man, and Berkeley himself would work several jobs from an early age, including bottle washer and cardigan weaver. There was nothing the young Berkeley liked to do more than to scour his collection of tattered and discarded schoolbooks for choice details about the filthy loves of gods and goddesses, as he described it. A dedicated self-educator, Berkeley lived to found the Socialist League in Leicester. In his memoirs, he reflects how many a studious youth had blessed Cassel for bringing out the Popular Educator. Now, the Popular Educator was just one of several cheap popular educational periodicals arising chiefly from the 1830s, 40s onwards, which were specifically designed to give the vulgar people more knowledge for a penny than the lords used to have for a pound. Built on the earlier enterprises in southeast Scotland and Lord Brougham's Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge came publications such as the Penny Magazine, Chambers Journal, and John Cassell's Popular Educator. In 1852, Cassell launched his famous Educator, which immediately became the staple reading of the working class autodidact. The alumni of Cassell's school, academy and university include the future Prime Minister David Lloyd George, as well as the workhouse boy who became Oxford Professor of Comparative Philology, Joseph Wright, who you see on the left smoking a pipe. Another of Cassell's beneficiaries was William Edwin Adams, the son of a tramping plasterer and himself an avid autodidact. Adams would live to become an influential journalist. In his Memoirs of a Social Atom, he recalled how English grammar was picked up from William Cobbett. The lessons in Cassell's Popular Educator afforded some insight into Latin. And although he believed that his reading of Tom Paine and attendance at lectures at the local philosophical institution had been perhaps more useful than his book studies, he still claimed that most of the self-educated people of my age and of later generations owe a deep debt of gratitude to John Cassell. John Cassell, born in 1817, he began life as a child labourer in a Manchester cotton mill and velveteen factory. He was apprenticed at 16 to a joiner in Salford. At 20, he walked away from the poverty of his childhood to London and opened a tea and coffee business. He ventured into the world of educational publishing for the purpose of issuing a series of publications calculated to advance the moral and social well-being of the working classes. One of these was The Working Man's Friend, established in 1850. Now, from its inception, it aimed to deliver what was wanted at the fireside of the working man, to improve his evening hour after his day of toil. Cassell had become a vociferous advocate for mutual instruction, which took place in what he called the Operative Academy. The universities are, he thought, insignificant institutions compared with our workers' establishments. Thomas Burke, a Northumberland miner, began working life as a trapper boy at the Haswell pit, but lived to become Privy Councillor to King Edward VII and father of the House of Commons. Burke considered Cassell's publication the chief handbook in his self-instruction. He remembers sitting at the table armed with the Popular Educator and a Latin dictionary, while with slate and pencil I translated as best I could the Latin lessons into English and the English into Latin. These Latin words with their English meanings I committed to memory. Burke's classical education was extensive. With only 2 years' worth of formal schooling, at 17 he embarked on a serious course of self-study. He read widely in translated classical literature and ancient history, including texts reproduced by one of the titans of cheap publishing, Henry Bonn. Before Bonn, buying new books would have been unthinkable on a miner's wage. His libraries, including his famed classical library of Greek and Roman classics, consisted of over 600 volumes. Burke remembered reading Gibbon. The stately, majestic march of his periods had some attraction for me even then, but the decline and fall, it must be admitted, was hard reading for an unlettered collier lad. Yet I plodded on until I had finished the book, which besides its direct teachings brought me many indirect advantages. Bond's contribution to people's classics goes deeper. He pioneered the provision of translated literature to the Victorian mass market, thus proving instrumental in the democratization of reading. Bond's classical library was not only enticingly cheap, but their uniformly ornate aesthetic made them also desirable to collect. Their popularity endured several decades. One obituary relates, it was Bond's obituary, relates how the British Library had to remove Bond's books from the reading room because they quickly became so mutilated by students who were not content with reading them during the hours at which the institution was open. Cheap book production reached fever pitch around 1830, when the provision of reading material for the newly discovered mass reading public was taken up by respectable London publishers. While their trashier competitors were symbolised by the ubiquitous and infamous penny bloods, they specialised instead in improving and at first predominantly religious literature. The residual evangelical suspicions surrounding imaginative texts without an overtly Christian message faded, and poetic and fictional non-copyright texts became a staple both of affordable periodicals and the mushrooming series of classics, such as the sixpenny Plutarch's Lives, issued monthly by Wardlock & Co. in 1885-6, or classical libraries. Great literature thus began to arrive in the homes of the British middle and working classes. Cheaper than Cassell's National Library were the thin, wire-stapled and intentionally ephemeral volumes of W.T. Stead's masterpiece library. Stead brought out weekly pamphlets of penny poets and penny popular novels. They both, of course, sold for a single penny, and sell they did, 11.5 million copies in a year. Stead was also a newspaper editor, publisher and social reformer. He aimed at enhancing the cultural range of the new reader, who is the product of the Education Act. That more or less brings us up to the 20th century, when Joseph Mallaby Dent's Everyman Library, which launched in 1906, took cheap reprint publishing and cross-class access to the Greek and Roman classics to a new level. The scale of this maverick publisher's achievement matches only his ambition. And while other publishers were releasing one title at a time, Dent decided to swamp the market and provide 50 titles each year. This produced savings on materials, but also an extremely intensive work plan for the editors. Everyman's Library printed 1,000 titles in its first 50 years. They include most standard works of Greek and Roman literature, as well as the most famous English works of ancient history. By 1975, more than 60 million copies had been purchased. They immediately became the standard texts for adult learners, including those many thousands engaged in WEA and Labour College courses. We can and should be inspired by the example of our democratizing forebears, of their discovery of a more or less easily navigable route to the wonderful cultural material that survives to us from the Greek and Roman worlds. We are in a position now, with so many excellent classical translations and freely available informal educational resources, and that formal infrastructure of secondary school classical subjects and university degree pathways, that we can offer a broader and better classical education than ever before, to more people than ever before. Now, given the ubiquity of classical culture over the past, at least 5 centuries, we can see that in our art, architecture, poetry, music, plays and movies, we would be seriously remiss to turn a blind eye to the classics poverty of modern Britain and risk cheating our children out of a cultural literacy with the potential to unlock so much of our common cultural inheritance.
I'm absolutely convinced that access to the world, society, the religion, the politics, the ideas, the culture and the literature and mythology and religion of the ancient Greeks and Romans is something that every single person should have some kind of knowledge of and access to at school. And we have a problem. The problem is that over the last few decades, any access whatsoever to the Greeks and Romans has been denied to almost all of them.
I really like the civilization part of things, just because I think it helps you understand how our society is built as well, and like the structures and the ways of life that we have at the moment.
You retain so much information. You learn to do that. You learn to see different sides. You understand different people and their opinions, and you can argue from both sides, which is incredible, and you can use that in so many different ways.
I go a huge debt to the classics. Classics have been in my bloodstream since I was 11. Absolutely absorbed it greedily. He gave me all kinds of models of eloquence I've been mining since in my poetry, in my theatre work, and in my films.
The study of the Latin and Greek languages is almost exclusively confined to the fee-paying sector. And in the modern world, with so much important curriculum for people to get through to learn basic skills for citizenship, to go to university, Latin and Greek have very much got marginalised. There are very few classics teachers around.
I do think there is a demand, but it's the difficulty is harnessing that and approaching the teachers and the head teachers and encouraging them and showing them what help is available to introduce these subjects.
We started off with 6 students studying for Latin GCSE, and we now have 73 involved between years 9 and year 13. I would defy anybody to take even a short course in classical civilization and not find something which engages them beyond their expectation.
We need to sell it creatively and show the teachers what the students can achieve.
Well, I've really started to get into, because it's about sometimes about other worlds, I've started to look at other dimensions like physics and science, because I really want to start learning about other dimensions and worlds.
Well, the histories made me want to visit Italy and Greece, just to see the cities and how they lived. The actual history, I've learned a lot from that, but also the language and about how much of it is the basis for modern European languages.
My name's Jack Oliver. I'm a weightlifter. I competed in the London Olympics and I've got a silver medal at the Commonwealth Games, and I'm also a classics graduate from University of Leeds.
It's always worth studying what the thing is that you find interesting, and that's one of the brilliant things about classics. It is inherently interdisciplinary, which means that there is something for everyone. So whether you're somebody who's interested in reading literature, whether you like studying history or art and archaeology, whether you're interested in philosophy or politics, you will find something for you.
I enjoy classics, I enjoy classical history, and normally I'm trying to tell people, like my fiance, about how great it is, and she doesn't want to listen. So if I kind of have that teaching role, then it gives me a way to kind of hopefully inspire other people to go down the same route I did, and show them that actually, you know, classical history is really interesting. You just need that opportunity to get involved in it like I did and spend some time in it. The more time you spend in it, the more you realise how much interesting material there is out there, and I want to be a part of that.
Oh, I really like ancient history because you definitely focus on certain people like Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, and getting to know the storyline, because it's not very well known. So when you go into it and do your own research, and you kind of really get into it and you're like, oh, this happened and this happened, and it's really, really enjoyable. I really like that. But then I also like learning overall civilizations and getting to really know how, comparing them to today.
They talk about the big wine mixing bowls, and you go to the British Museum and they actually exist, these things that are talked about in these fantastical stories. You know, it's like watching something like Game of Thrones and then finding out that it's really quite real, and not only that, it's like your origins as well of your society, so that's really cool.
The thing that always strikes me about it is that as a humanities subject, it is about studying human beings. It's about how they think, how they feel, how they treat each other, how they organise their societies, how they deal with issues like gender or class or ethnicity. And in thinking about those in other societies and societies of the past, I think that really enables us to interrogate our own society. I think it also helps to create empathy. And I think that anything that enables the adults of the future to develop empathy and understanding has got to be a good thing.
One thing that's really fascinating about heroism in classical literature is that it shows you how a hero does not have to be perfect. They all have their flaws, but sometimes their flaws, they use them as part of their qualities as well. And I think that's really important, because you cannot be the perfect human, but you can be a better version of yourself.
It's really interesting. It has scope for freedom of expression and like debate within the classroom, because you talk about all these morals that they had at the time that we don't, and you kind of have you get to have a nice debate on the morals of society today. So
that I think it will prepare you for anything really, because it provides you with a foundation of skills.
Perception of the subject is a really big challenge. Not so much the pupils, because you can often inspire them. It's often the parents who don't realise what the value of the subject is, or often because they don't even know what the subject is at all. I've had so many parents at Parents' Evening come and say, well, actually, now what is this that you actually do with my pupil or my child every week?
Lots of our students, it's the first time they've come across these subjects before. They've not studied them at secondary school. They've not necessarily come from backgrounds where they've read a huge amount about the myths or anything like that. So really seeing it come alive, and in particular when those students then decide that that's something they want to pursue at higher education. So I suppose that's the most rewarding aspect.
So a big challenge is educating parents on what the subject really is. Secondly, educating them on why it's valuable, where it can actually take their son or their daughter, because that's the main parental concern, is what job will they get in the future.
It's also important to think about the kinds of skills that an education in classical civilization brings. It's brilliant for training critical thinking skills, for analysing all kinds of different sources, for argumentation, and all those kinds of transferable skills which are really useful in other areas of life.
I think particularly studying and focusing on my dissertation on direct democracy, the skill of argument was particularly important, and the need to be heard and to be well spoken as a politician in ancient Athens was particularly important, because you had to achieve the vote of every individual, which in that case was every male over the age of 18 who was eligible to vote.
Ancient Greek culture and literature, you see the importance of being a well-presented and able to talk and argue and put your point across human being, because that is why people pay you respect, that's why people respect you.
The point about classical civilization and ancient history qualifications, though, is that they can be taught by a teacher of any subject. They can be qualified with a PGCE, postgraduate certificate in education, or similar qualification in any subject whatsoever. One of our project's most important teacher partners is a man in Milton Keynes who's a physics teacher.
So, we now offer 2 courses, GCSE Latin and A-Level Classical Civilization. Developing that has been one of the most fulfilling things I've done as a member of staff, as a teacher here.
We've got teachers of English, teachers of history, teachers of religious studies and philosophy, teachers of modern languages, even PE teachers and business studies teachers.
I was a teacher of philosophy in a sixth form college at Christ the King in Lewisham, and I was teaching philosophy and religious studies there, and there was a gap really. They had never offered classical civilization, thought it would fit in, and managed to make contact with Edith Hall, who came in to meet our principal.
Simon, who is the other classics teacher at the school, we did our Duke of Edinburgh training together, and so that's a lot of time spent walking in the rain and camping, and I suppose that's where we became friends, and we got talking, and we both knew that we had a shared enjoyment of the subject.
And there was a discussion, and we began to offer it as an additional subject.
And it was just, well, why don't we give this a shot? We took it to the head, And because there were two of us, I tried to broach it beforehand, and it was no, because obviously if I left, then there was no one left to teach it. And that was the excuse given, or the reason given. Not excuse, that's unkind. And then when I walked in with, well, actually, Mr. Callahan will teach it with me, so there's two of us now.
And this year, we'll begin to offer it as a full A level for the first time, which we're very excited about.
And then there was, he said, fine, I'll give you a shot. We had a shot at the GCSE. 25 students took it, and that's it, no looking back. And we got the A level because of that.
So these subjects can be rolled out in almost any school in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, and in parts of Scotland, if there is a teacher who wants to teach them.
CCK, Classic English, I'm currently reading the Odyssey, and I'm here with my fellow classical students. Okay, come in here.
My name's Hannah, and I am a student at Christ the King Sixth Form College in Lewisham. The book is something that we explored as a class, so we were able to sort of read a chapter week by week, so it wasn't too much pressure.
We've started to work in a lot of Bristol schools recently at Key Stage 3 by trying to look at classical civilization across the curriculum.
The subject is just so much fun and so amazing because of the possibilities and things you can do with it. It's so fun. You can go outside, you can use it, you can build things with it, you can act it out, and it's honestly one of the best things best decisions I've ever made to choose it for GCSE.
And we've discovered with this project, the more we travel across the country, that there are people like this and enthusiastic students, parents and teachers absolutely everywhere.
And by doing it in that way, we're finding that we're actually beginning to generate quite a desire amongst pupils to do more and to go up to GCSE.
It's a fun subject and it's something everyone should be able to see because it's so interesting.
I feel like people think it's boring and doesn't relate to them, but like if you study it, I feel like it's interesting. Like there's so many things that happened back in them days that happen now that you wouldn't think happened but actually happen.
One thing that's been quite rewarding is they're making parallels between their lives today in Lewisham to societies that existed 2,500 years ago or so.
I think classics as a whole has a reputation of being quite an elitist subject, so when you come from a state school background and you tell people who don't attend a state school, oh, you actually have prior knowledge in classics, especially with the experience I've had with applying to universities, it makes you stand out more. But also I think by not offering it to state schools, it's almost keeping it with that elitist reputation.
In a sense, classical civilization probably is currently the most interesting subject I teach, partly because of the diversity of topics that they're studying, because in a sense it is a bit different to anything else that we offer.
I am the programme director at a small charity called Classics for All. Well, it's got one very simple aim actually, which is to revive the teaching of classics in state schools.
One of my favorite things is probably the fact that it's like an ancient piece of literature, probably one of the first in Europe to exist, and it's just really incredible to see like what the Greeks thought of and how advanced their society was at the time.
What are 21st century skills? I'd like you to spend a minute talking to the person next to you, seeing if you can name what some of the skills are that have this label.
We learned about the Greek times through the book, The Odyssey, and my teacher, Mr. Barnett, helped us learn some more things inside that era, such as the way they spoke, the roles of women, Xenia, and different themes that are all explored in the book.
What I've learned through working for Classics for All is just how powerful classical civilization and ancient history are as a subject, and pupils love them. And I think one of the reasons they like them is because particularly classical civilization covers such a range of subject areas.
My class, we built replicas of Spartan shields, and we went out into the playground and we mirrored the ancient formations, and we had a mock battle, and that was just so fun and it made my day, and that no other subject would ever do that.
There have been 6 extraordinary moments of transformation or change in the entire history of our species, Homo sapiens. The Greek and Roman period is the third of them, and in some ways the most important.
We can think beyond what Homer means in the Odyssey, and we can make our own connotations of what Homer actually means. He's going me back into literature again, after I didn't really like it in GCSE that much.
It's just a story.
True.
It gives them notions of history contextually. It helps them to understand rational argument and debate. I think there are thousands of reasons why, in the terms of the humanities curriculum, that subjects like ancient history and classical civilization are tremendously useful in producing rounded citizens with good contextual knowledge of the world that they live in.
Why would we want our teenagers to go to school, go to sixth form college, and not come out knowing about the most important 1,000 years in human history and culture?
We need to promote awareness of classicists in public life.
It's from Greek drama that we learn to feel, that we learn to express the innermost complicated passions of our soul. And I think Greek drama, all those thousands of years ago, gives us the complete way, the road, in order to find where we're going.
But a few years ago, I made a documentary for Radio 4 about Greek tragedy and soap opera, and about the overlaps between these two seemingly quite divergent art forms. One, high art that happens in theatres where people pay expensive money for tickets and go and put on their nice clothes and do all of those things and blah, blah, blah.
I'm not a politician, but we should try and bring it back in. My school is doing a half course of classical civilization, and I think that's a good way, because for those willing to do it as an extracurricular GCSE, it's a good experience and it really helps.
In spite of the fact there are lots of obviously very brilliant theatres and student companies doing lots of productions of classics which are, you can go see Greek tragedies at the Scoop in the middle of London during the summer, often for 0 pence, precisely 0 pence. But there is still a sense that it's for other people perhaps sometimes, and there shouldn't be. We don't have that attitude to soap. Right? You might think it's not for me because it's too lame. You might think it's not for me, I'm out having fun kissing boys on the mouth. Or girls, you can kiss whoever you want on the mouth. At the time that EastEnders goes out, that is a perfectly acceptable thing to be doing. But people don't generally think, oh, that's not for me. That's a separate category of thing from the things that you might not be interested, but you don't think it's for other people.
I am Paul Found and Head of Classics at the Norton Natural School here in Ashford in Kent. Through the literature we study, we're really looking at sort of cultural diversity, different cultures, cultural awareness, and hopefully cultural and social tolerance.
So what sort of things are you talking about there? Things about Nero and what he did to certain people.
It's quite lively, the discussions as well, because we're all very interested in the topic. We've all got our opinions, especially when it came to the women module, because obviously we've got quite a lot of girls in our class this year at sixth form. And so I always look forward to classics because it's definitely one of the most interesting subjects, but also it's one of the ones where you can just sit down and you don't really realise you're learning because you're just completely interested in what you're talking about.
The point is that Greek tragedy and soap have loads and loads of overlaps, not least because the people who write soaps all do the same drama writing course in this country, run by the BBC, and the BBC teaches its principles of drama writing. So if you're thinking of becoming a playwright or a screenwriter, a TV writer or a film writer, then this is where you could be learning your trade, right? They teach the principles of drama writing from Aristotle.
Classics managed to make its way into all my other subjects as well. Like even psychology, there's references to how people with mental disorders and stuff from such a long time ago and things, and how it would have been dealt with from the classical era and things like that. And the more time you spend studying classics, the more you realise it is in everything.
The students are actually mortified when they're reading it, and like that couldn't possibly have been allowed to happen. Yes, it could. And it was normal, you know, and then they read things that happen today, that how is that still allowed to happen? I don't think any of these students come from a primary school or secondary school where Latin is on the curriculum, or certainly not where ancient Greek is on the curriculum. So how are you going to access the classics?
The issue is simply one of willpower. Financially, the costs are very, very small if we can identify the right enthusiastic teachers and enthuse them. And with the financial aspects, which can involve a bit of retraining, some special courses, summer courses, and courses in the holidays, or enrolling for some open university, extra tuition or whatever for the teachers, they can involve certain costs in bringing in some new textbooks and so on.
So we've had the controlled assessment, which covered the women in Nero's life, and we studied Suetonius Tacitus. Then we moved on to the Odyssey and looked at particularly the Great Wanderings, which I found probably the most interesting topic so far. I like the characters in it, the way that they sort of intertwine, the sort of relationships in it. I found that interesting. So I think that I will bump up my GCSE next year and continue it throughout year 11 and possibly at A-level as well.
I would like to incorporate it into my job because I find it so much interesting, and it's good to have a job that you find fun, and that is what I find fun.
And so we are currently running an AHRC funded project called Advocating Classics Education. And we're working very hard with 16 university partners around the UK to extend provision of the study of classics in translation. We hope eventually to every mainstream non-fee paying school in the country.
The great thing is that there's a national charity called Classics for All who are also working in concert and partnership with them and have already given out large amounts of money in small amounts to individual schools across the nation. And this is very exciting, so that if you get in touch with us via our website or by an email to either me or Arlene, then you can find out much more about the next practical steps to take in introducing these qualifications.
I do feel identified as a classicist, and it's something that I do love because it's opened so many doors to me. We've been invited to talk to other students at King's in Canterbury in the autumn, and that's something that I feel will be amazing, an opportunity because you can interact with other people, and these are all things that classics has opened up for me. So before I didn't really know what I want to do, but now I want to go on to teach it because it has been something that has been so interesting to me.
This is still your land. You gotta make us lucky, brother, telling your story to the man. Gotta make us lucky, brother, telling your story.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to a sunny but rather chilly Blackpool. My name's Peter Wright, and I'm based at the Blackpool Sixth Form College, and I've taught ancient history, classical civilization for sort of 14 years now. I'm a specialist leader in education for modern history and an examiner with modern history, and I also coordinate our Oxbridge programme at the Sixth Form College. So firstly, just thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the collaboration, some of the partnership that's going on in Blackpool, and really sort of what I see my role is just to wrap up the panel, is to almost provide you with a view from the cold face as to what access is like to classics right now. And really what I'd like to offer you is the idea about how classics can be a real driver in boosting educational achievement and aspiration in an area like Blackpool. So where are we? For those of us joining from international areas, where are we? If we can put the next slide on, you can see where Blackpool is in the sunny northwest. We're renowned for the Blackpool Tower, for the wonderful illuminations for ballroom dancing. Strictly fans will know Blackpool, and of course our beach, our promenade, and our donkeys. However, despite the tourism, literally 100, 200 metres behind our Golden Mile, we've got some very, very, very real problems in Blackpool. And this is where I think classics, as an umbrella term, can really work incredibly effectively in the 21st century. So if we can have the next slide on, I've just got a few little bits of statistics there to tell you a little bit about the Blackpool situation and to provide a little bit of context for you with how we're rolling out classics in this area. Blackpool is an area of high deprivation, and in an educational situation, what does deprivation really mean? Well, deprivation, we measure deprivation in a high school setting in the UK in regard to free school meals and something called pupil premium. And apologies for the text being quite small there, but you can see that Blackpool is actually the 9th highest area in the UK in regard to pupil premium, in regard to free school meals, and both at the primary level and at secondary, we vastly exceed the national average. Similarly, when it comes to average attainment, and I've used the 18-19 statistics there just prior to the pandemic, our average attainment scores are also substantially lower than the national average. And as I said, this is where I think that classics can really show its relevancy in boosting a vast measure and range of statistics that sort of really puts a depressing image on Blackpool. So there are some real challenges here, but what I want to show you very briefly is that there are some spectacular opportunities for us. So if we can have the next slide, I can show you the Blackpool Classics for All hub. At the Sixth Form College, we've had a highly successful and popular classical civilization and an ancient history A-level offer for a number of years now. Every year we have over 100 students that are taking part in classical civilization or ancient history A-level. And following discussions with Classics for All, we were awarded a grant which led to the establishment of a Blackpool Classics hub. And classics here is represented in all of its different and various guises. So the bottom line are the wonderful primary schools that are introducing, or have introduced rather, classics to their pupils, Latin, Greek, but also ancient history and class civ. And then the middle section are our fantastic high schools who are offering ancient history, classical civilization, Latin and Greek, not only as part of the curriculum, but also in various after school and lunch clubs. The fantastic figure that I'm able to share with you is that we've got over 600 students engaging with some form of classics every single week in Blackpool. So how is this working? Well, I have to apologize for my next slide and my slightly low budget Parthenon. But if we can put the next slide on, what I've suggested is almost a Blackpool model that seems to be working for us. And basically, this model was put together with the sort of foundation beliefs that firstly, classics can be a real effective tool to raise aspirations and educational success. Secondly, it can improve educational outcomes, but also I think really, really, really importantly, that classics in translation and students being given access to classics in translation can be an incredible platform for introducing Latin and ancient Greek. So what I'm going to do just very briefly is just to explain just each of these sort of sections and how classics is working in the Blackpool area to almost give a bit of food for thought to colleagues listening to the session. So if we can have the next slide, what I've done here is I've showed you how we've tried to build on school relationships and networks. And initially, when setting up the hub with the different primary schools and secondary schools, it was very much a case of banging the drum, so to speak. And what that meant was going to teach meet events, very much sort of spreading the word of classics to colleagues in the different high schools and different primary schools, and also getting our students involved in seeing primary and secondary students. Everything from actor visits to ancient numeracy and using sort of Egyptian, Greek and Latin numbers. And really what we were really trying to do in the early stages was to show how beneficial the various cross-curricular links were for primary and secondary colleagues, everything from how Latin and Greek could weave into foreign language or MFL strategies, religion, literature, music, art, geography, etc. It also meant seeing the various head teachers forums and making various presentations, really to sort of emphasize again the cross-curricular merits of Latin, Greek, ancient history, class civ. And what we were using in a primary level is we were using the Minimus scheme, the highly structured Minimus Latin course, which is fantastic because it's so accessible for non-specialists and really sort of gave non-specialist teachers almost a pick up and play approach. And this early stage was incredibly successful, and we had 2 to 3 very, very, very successful pilot schemes within our primary settings. However, despite the success that we had in terms of the numbers of children accessing classics, the real question was this having an impact on their educational achievement and their scores almost at a primary level? So if we can pop the next slide on, what we were able to benefit from was the Government Opportunity Area Research Grant. And this allowed me to investigate the question, as you can see in bold there, does Latin aid in the development of academic vocabulary for Blackpool pupils? And what we were using was using one of our local schools, Norbreck Primary Academy, which has high levels of pupil premium and free school meal students. And what we were doing with the 93 Year 6 pupils is we were testing whether the exposure to Latin would have an impact in regard to their understanding of Tier 2 academic words. Now, for non-teachers here, what are Tier 2 academic words? Tier 2 are high frequency words used in an academic setting. They're not subject specific words. So language that you would see in exam questions and papers: fortunate, significant, benevolent, those type of words. And I'd love to go into a little bit more detail here, but I've just got the research in the school in just the one bullet point at the bottom. Essentially, we were testing whether the Tier 2 words prevalent in the Latin Minimus course would actually assist students decode words that they hadn't, that were linked to those Minimus words, which was linked to the Latin words. Would it enable them to access that vocabulary? And over a 2-term period of 45 minutes a week exposure to Latin, the results were absolutely outstanding. And if we can just get if we have a little click here, you can see some of the figures that we actually found from our research. And again, it would be great to go in a little bit more depth here, but I'm conscious of time. But we actually had a 73% improvement for boys' vocabulary, which was just absolutely staggering. And it shows you again that classics can be a real tool in boosting educational achievement. In regard to high schools, if we can have the next slide, what I've seen really working successfully is almost a Trojan horse approach in exposing pupils to classics, either lunchtime, after school societies with ancient history, Latin and Greek, but also GCSE skills focused workshops where Latin really enables students to build up their GCSE skills in other subjects. And if you can see the next slide, you can see some various examples of that, with its modern history, looking at sort of Augustan propaganda, English literature, looking at the Aeneid and different scenes as part of that unseen poetry paper, science, but also English language and comparing text. And that's been a really successful route into high schools. Finally, if we look at the next slide, we've also had a lot of success in regard to teacher training in embedding Latin and classics and class civ and ancient history rather into the school environment. And really what this shows is really, again, classics can be at the forefront of etymology and vocabulary strategies and literacy improvement in our schools in areas such as Blackpool. Really, it can boost that old-fashioned concept of cultural capital. And again, what I think classics really offers our schools is a really effective tool in promoting an oracy skills and the push for oracy in our schools. So despite our great growth that we've had in primary schools and at A-level, we've still got that missing link of GCSE numbers, as Arlene's presentation was showing. And is that because Class Civ, Ancient History, Latin and Greek is still very much viewed as a risk by senior leader teams? And certainly what I want to finish with is just a final slide with some food for thought for the various discussion groups as to what we can do to close this gap and to boost the numbers that are taking GCSE classics in its various different forms. Firstly, the idea that ancient history and class civ is often seen as a harder option than modern history. And certainly this is an issue in regard to the complexity and the amount of literature and content in the GCSE compared to the modern history, and also at the A-level situation as well. As an examiner for GCSE modern history and a teacher of A-level modern history, there is a real disparity in terms of the literature and concepts and skills of ancient history and class civ versus modern history. And that's why modern history is often viewed by senior leaders as an easier option, so to speak. Secondly, there's very much, and this is more of an ancient history issue, a barrier of the big man approach, and that we can certainly see that in the A-level ancient history. That's less of an issue in classical civilization, which potentially explains why the numbers accessing classical civilization at A-level are larger than ancient history. And thirdly, and finally, really the availability of ready-made resources. There's been a lot of work that's been going on in the classics community recently. What we need to do in order to boost numbers at a GCSE and in order to get senior leaders to take the plunge of offering classics is really offer a pick up and play approach at GCSE and at A-level. So schools with non-specialists have a viable option to introduce this onto the curriculum. Certainly, if we can bridge this gap, then the opportunity to study classics can be brought to even more pupils in areas such as Blackpool. And really what I think this offers is a fantastic situation, which gives us a real exciting challenge for the future. Classics really as something in regards to an actual tool to really boost that educational performance, to raise aspirations in areas such as Blackpool. So thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to some questions on this. Hopefully it's provided a little bit of insight and a little bit of food for thought.